The town of Ashford, tucked against the rolling plains of Nebraska, was a place where tradition clung stubbornly to every street corner, church pew, and kitchen table. At the turn of the 20th century, Ashford looked much like countless other small American towns: red brick storefronts, a whitewashed courthouse, dirt roads that turned to mud after rain, and an ever-present rhythm of horse hooves and blacksmith hammers. It was a place where the men worked the fields, ran the shops, and manned the rifles, while women were expected to sew, to cook, to tend children, and to keep their voices soft. It was, in short, not a world built to expect someone like Clara Dawson. Clara was born into a farming family in 1892, the second of 4 children and the only daughter. Her father, Matthew Dawson, was a weathered man whose hands bore the scars of a lifetime of plowing fields and mending fences. He was strict, but he was also fair, and he believed each child, boy or girl, should learn to fend for themselves. It was Matthew who first placed a rifle in Clara's small hands when she was no more than 10 years old. At the time, it wasn't a statement of equality or rebellion. It was survival. Coyotes prowled near the chicken coops, foxes snuck into the barns, and in the countryside, every set of eyes was needed to keep the farm safe. Clara remembered the first time she steadied the old Winchester against her shoulder. The rifle was nearly as long as she was tall, the wood worn smooth from her father's use. Matthew had crouched beside her, his gravelly voice guiding her as she squinted toward a tin can balanced on a fence post. "Don't fight it," he had said. "Listen to the rifle. Breathe slow. Feel the heartbeat in your chest. Let the world go quiet before you squeeze." She followed his words, inhaled, and fired. The recoil jolted her backward, but the can flew off the fence. The sound of her father's low whistle still lingered in her memory. But outside the farm, the world had little patience for such things. Women were expected to be delicate, not deadly. The church ladies whispered when they heard Clara spent afternoons out in the fields, shooting cans instead of stitching quilts. At social gatherings, the men joked openly. "Careful, boys," one would say with a chuckle. Clara might mistake her sewing needle for a rifle. Laughter followed, never cruel enough to warrant anger, but sharp enough to remind Clara of her place. By the time she was 18, the whispers had grown louder. The country was shifting, factories were rising, cities expanding, and the suffragist movement was beginning to make its presence felt. But in Ashford, change came slow, if at all. For young women, the path was still narrow. Marry well, raise children, and keep house. Clara's brothers were encouraged to dream of land, of businesses, of service in the militia. She, on the other hand, was advised to practice her pie crusts. Yet Clara's heart didn't stir at the thought of ovens or embroidery. What made her pulse quicken was the sharp crack of a rifle, the weight of wood and iron in her hands, the silence of a moment before a shot broke the air. When she practiced alone in the fields, she felt a clarity that nothing else in her life provided. Out there, no one told her what she could or could not be. Out there, the only truth was the target, her aim, and the certainty of a bullet flying. True, the men of Ashford dismissed her as eccentric. They didn't believe she was dangerous, just misguided. Some pitied her, others teased her, but none took her seriously. That suited Clara, at least at first. She learned to hold her tongue. In public, to smile politely when mocked, and to let her rifle speak only in private. Still, each comment, each laugh, planted a seed of defiance in her chest. It was during these years that Clara began working part-time in town, helping at the general store. She'd stack flour sacks, sweep the floors, and tend to customers. But what she loved most was listening. Soldiers sometimes passed through, their uniforms catching the eyes of children. They spoke of marksmanship drills, of shooting competitions that decided who was best in a unit, of glory earned by precision, and calm under pressure. Clara listened with rapt attention, her hands pausing mid-task as the men described the contests. One winter evening, as the townsfolk gathered at the Grange Hall for a social, Clara overheard a group of young men discussing an upcoming shooting competition. The local militia was organizing trials, open to anyone who wished to test their skill. It was meant to draw out the best marksmen of the county, a display of pride and preparation should they ever be called to service. Clara's ears burned as the men joked, boasting of who would come out on top. "Reckon I'll take first place," one of them laughed. "Ain't nobody can beat my aim, not even the sergeant." Another added with a smirk, "Well, we won't have to worry about any ladies showing up, that's for sure. Unless one of them wants to darn the targets after we're done." The group erupted in laughter, loud enough to echo off the wooden beams of the hall. Clara's cheeks flushed, but not from embarrassment. It was something hotter, sharper, a mix of anger and resolve. She sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded, but inside a decision was forming. For years, she had accepted the boundaries others set for her. She had practiced in the shadows, honing a skill that no one believed mattered. But now, with this competition announced, she saw a chance. It wasn't about winning prizes or applause. It was about stepping into the light, about proving that her shots were as real, as sharp, and as undeniable as any man's. The next morning, Clara walked to the militia office and signed her name to the entry list. The clerk looked up in surprise, his pen pausing mid-stroke. "You sure about this, Miss Dawson?" he asked, his tone more amused than skeptical. "I'm sure," she said evenly, meeting his gaze. Word spread like wildfire through Ashford. A woman, Clara Dawson, of all people, had entered the shooting trials. By evening, every porch in town buzzed with conversation. Some scoffed. Others laughed until tears streamed down their faces. A few shook their heads in disapproval, muttering about impropriety and foolishness. The men preparing for the competition treated it as a joke, already making wagers on how quickly she'd fail. "She won't hit the target at all," one predicted. "I bet she drops the rifle before she even pulls the trigger," another laughed. But beneath their mockery was a sliver of unease. Clara's calm, steady presence unsettled them more than they admitted. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't rise to their bait. She simply continued with her chores, her practice, and her quiet determination. As the day of the trials drew closer, Clara's nights were spent under the stars, her rifle steady against her shoulder, the sound of crickets filling the air. She practiced until her fingers ached and her eyes blurred, not because she doubted her skill, but because she wanted certainty. She knew the world would watch, not hoping for her success, but expecting her failure. And if she missed even once, their laughter would drown out everything else. In that world, in that town, in that time, Clara Dawson was not expected to succeed. She wasn't expected to stand on the line beside the men. She wasn't expected to aim, to fire, to win. But as she cleaned her rifle one last time on the eve of the competition, her reflection caught in the lantern light. She whispered to herself the truth she carried deep inside. They could laugh all they wanted. Soon, she would give them something they could never laugh away. Clara Dawson had always been a quiet soul, more comfortable with the whisper of wind across the prairie than the chatter of parlors or the echo of hymns beneath the church roof. But there was fire beneath her quietness, and it had been kindled long before anyone in Ashford thought to laugh at her. That fire began on a spring morning when she was 12 years old. The family's cornfield stretched green and endless across the horizon, and with it came the pests that threatened the harvest. Her brothers were out gathering tools, her mother inside kneading dough, and Clara had been sent to chase crows from the rows. Her father, weary from dawn to dusk labor, appeared at her side with the old Winchester cradled in his arms. "Birds won't listen to shouts forever," he had said, his voice low and even. "Sometimes you need something they respect." He set the rifle in her hands. At first, it felt impossibly heavy, the barrel dragging her arms downward, the wood stock cool against her cheek. But her father's rough hands guided hers, his patience softening the sharpness of his words. "Don't rush. Breathe. Find the stillness." Clara steadied, took aim, and fired. The crack startled the flock into the air, and though she missed, the excitement in her chest was unforgettable. The rifle had spoken, and in its voice she had heard possibility. From then on, Clara practiced whenever she could. Tin cans balanced on fence posts, bottles lined against stones, knotholes in barn walls, all became her silent opponents. She learned the art of patience, of holding her breath until the world shrank into the circle of a sight. She learned discipline, for a single careless tug on the trigger could send a bullet wide. And slowly, through trial and error, she grew into a marksman no one expected. But no matter how steady her aim, the world outside the farm had no interest in her skill. By 16, Clara was expected to master bread and butter, not black powder and bullets. At church gatherings, the older women leaned over their hymnals to whisper, "Poor girl, still wasting time with that rifle." The younger men laughed, calling out across the street, "Hey, Dawson, teaching yourself to shoot squirrels for supper?" Sometimes she laughed with them, her smile disarming enough to quiet their jeers. But when she turned away, her jaw clenched and her fists tightened around invisible steel. They didn't understand that shooting wasn't a distraction for her. It was focus. It was freedom. One particularly bitter afternoon, Clara overheard two boys talking as she swept the general store floor. "Dawson's girl tried target practice again yesterday. Nearly scared half the chickens to death." They laughed, their voices filling the room, and Clara's face flushed hot. She wanted to turn and correct them, that she had struck 3 cans in a row from 40 yards. But what would be the use? Their laughter was armor, and her words would bounce harmlessly off. Yet in that moment, the spark of defiance inside her burned brighter. She did not want their approval, not anymore. She wanted to prove them wrong, and not just with whispered claims or private victories. She wanted to show them. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. In February of 1911, the county militia posted notices across Ashford. A shooting competition would be held in March and open trial for any man wishing to prove his worth as a marksman. It was both tradition and preparation, for the war was a distant rumor. The nation valued readiness. Competitors would test themselves with rifles on the training ground, and the best shots would earn not only prizes, but recognition. Clara spotted the notice tacked to the post office board while delivering a basket of eggs. She read it twice, her pulse quickening. Open trial. No mention of men only. She looked around, half expecting someone to tear the paper down before her. Eyes, but it remained, its black ink glaring against the pale wood. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table as her brothers chattered about the event. "It'll be a fine chance," one of them said. "Reckon I'll win, no doubt." Her mother chuckled. "As long as you don't embarrass yourself missing every target." Clara stayed silent, her spoon tracing circles in her stew. But inside, her thoughts raced. Could she? Should she? The laughter of the town already stung her daily. Entering the competition would only make it worse. They'd mock her mercilessly if she failed. But what if she didn't fail? That night, she lay awake, long after the lantern was blown out, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling. She thought of her father's steady voice. She thought of tin cans tumbling from fence posts, bottles shattering clean, and the way her heart steadied in the stillness before a shot. And she thought of the men's smug laughter, their certainty that the world was theirs to dominate. Her decision was made before dawn. The next morning, Clara dressed plainly, her braid tucked behind her shoulder, and walked into town. The air was sharp with frost, her boots crunching over the dirt road. She stopped before the militia office, her hand hovering at the door. For a moment, doubt gnawed at her. What if they refused her outright? What if her name became the subject of every cruel joke in town? But the spark in her chest flared again, pushing her forward. Inside, a clerk sat behind a worn desk, a ledger open before him. He looked up startled as Clara stepped inside. "I'd like to enter the competition," she said, her voice steady. The man blinked, then chuckled, as though she had told a clever joke. "Miss Dawson, you understand this is a rifle trial? Not a quilting bee?" "I understand," she replied, her gaze unwavering. The clerk hesitated, then shrugged. "Well, it's an open list. Can't say no." He dipped his pen in ink and scratched her name onto the page. When she turned to leave, he muttered, "This ought to be interesting." By evening, word had spread. Ashford buzzed with disbelief. At the barber shop, men joked so hard they slapped their knees. At the grocer's, women whispered in dismay, shaking their heads at Clara's nonsense. Children repeated what they heard at home, giggling when she walked by. "She thinks she can shoot. Maybe she'll trip before she even pulls the trigger." The ridicule rolled over Clara like thunder, but it did not shake her. If anything, each remark was fuel. Let them laugh, she thought. They had no idea what she carried in her hands, or in her heart. That night, she took the Winchester into the fields once more. The moon was high, silver light painting the grass in shades of white and shadow. She set up targets along the fence. Breathed deeply and began. Shot after shot cracked the silence, each one finding its mark. Her arms ached, her fingers blistered, but she continued until she could strike without hesitation. At last, she lowered the rifle and gazed at the night sky. Stars glittered across the heavens, unbothered by human laughter or doubt. Clara smiled faintly. The town might think her a fool, but the stars, the rifle, and the stillness knew better. And soon, so would everyone else. The morning of the competition dawned cold and bright, a sharp March wind sweeping across the prairie. Frost still clung to the edges of fences, and the dirt road leading to the militia training ground was lined with wagon tracks and footprints from men hurrying toward the event. Word of the trials had spread far beyond Ashford. Farmers from outlying homesteads, shopkeepers from neighboring towns, even curious mothers and children had gathered to watch. Competitions like these weren't everyday affairs, and the promise of seeing the county's finest sharpshooters show off their skill had drawn a crowd. Clara Dawson walked alone down the road, her rifle case slung over her shoulder. She wore a simple brown dress beneath a sturdy coat, her boots crunching against the hard ground. Heads turned as she passed. Some whispered, others laughed outright. A group of young boys pointed and snickered, one calling out, "Don't miss, Miss Dawson." His friends cackled as though the joke were the cleverest thing in the world. Clara kept her eyes forward, her face calm, though her heart thumped like a drum inside her chest. The militia training ground stretched out like a stage prepared for spectacle. Wooden targets were lined up at varying distances, each painted with circles that gleamed faintly in the morning light. Beyond them, hills rolled endlessly into the horizon. At one end of the field stood a long line of competitors, men in heavy coats with rifles polished and ready. They greeted one another with boisterous laughter, slapping shoulders, and boasting loudly of their expected victories. When Clara stepped onto the field, the laughter paused and rose again, sharper this time. "Well, look who showed up after." "All," one man called, his grin wide. "Thought you'd change your mind, Miss Dawson." Another chimed in. "Careful now. Don't point that thing at us by mistake." The group roared, their voices carrying across the field. Clara ignored them, moving quietly to the registration table where the sergeant sat with a ledger. The sergeant was a broad-shouldered man with a bristling mustache, his expression one of practiced authority. He raised his brows when Clara handed over her name slip, but said nothing beyond a curt nod. "You'll take your place at the far end," he said. Clara followed his instruction, walking past rows of men who muttered and chuckled under their breath. Some looked her over with disdain, others with curiosity, but none with respect. She set her case down, opened it carefully, and lifted the Winchester into the light. The familiar weight steadied her trembling hands, grounding her as the noise of the crowd swelled around her. From the spectator stands, the townsfolk were already buzzing. Clara could hear fragments of conversation drifting down. "Can you believe it? A woman in the competition. She'll be out after the first round, mark my words. It's a shame, really, making a fool of herself like that." The sergeant blew his whistle, the sharp note cutting through the chatter. "Competitors, step forward." The men lined up at their marks, Clara at the far end of the row. The targets were set at 50 yards for the first round, a distance meant to test basic precision. Each man would fire 3 shots, the scores tallied on the spot. The order would move down the line, one shooter after another. Clara's mouth was dry, her palms damp despite the chill. She watched the first man step up, his stance confident, his rifle gleaming in the sun. He fired 3 times in quick succession, striking close to the bullseye with each shot. The crowd cheered, and he returned to his place, grinning broadly. The next man followed, then the next, each shot drawing applause or groans depending on accuracy. The men boasted loudly between turns, clapping each other on the back. All the while, Clara stood in silence, her rifle resting at her side, her eyes fixed on the targets. When one of the younger competitors noticed her watching, he sneered. "Don't strain your eyes, Dawson. Targets don't look any closer, no matter how hard you stare." His friends laughed, but Clara didn't respond. Instead, she studied the way the wind tugged at the flags near the targets, the subtle shifts in air that could nudge a bullet just off course. She noted the rhythm of the shots, the way each man's breathing rose and fell before pulling the trigger. She was not here to exchange banter. She was here to listen, to learn, and to wait. Her turn crept closer. Each step down the line brought her nearer to the moment she had both dreaded and anticipated for weeks. Her stomach twisted with tension, but beneath it was a strange calm. She knew her rifle. She knew her skill. What she did not know was how steady she would remain under the eyes of the entire county. Finally, the sergeant's voice boomed. "Clara." "Dawson." A ripple went through the crowd, followed by laughter that rose like a wave. Clara walked forward, her boots steady on the packed earth, her Winchester firm in her hands. She stopped at the firing line, the target gleaming white against the distance. For a heartbeat, the noise of the crowd faded, leaving only the sound of wind and her own breath. "Proceed," the sergeant said, his tone unreadable. Clara set her stance, the rifle snug against her shoulder. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the expectation of failure hanging heavy in the air. From the stands, someone called, "Don't trip, Clara." Another voice followed, "Hope you packed a thimble, not bullets." Laughter erupted again, louder than before. Her hands trembled, just slightly. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing her father's voice in her memory. "Don't fight it. Breathe slow. Let the world go quiet before you squeeze." She opened her eyes, exhaled, and raised the rifle. The crowd hushed as if drawn by some invisible string. Men who moments ago had been jeering now leaned forward, curious despite themselves. The world narrowed to a single circle, the target waiting in the distance. Clara's finger tightened gently on the trigger, her breathing steady, her heartbeat slowing. She could feel the tension gathering, not just in her body, but in the crowd behind her, a collective anticipation. The rifle cracked, the sound sharp, and final, echoing across the field. The bullet sped toward its mark. And in that instant, before anyone could see where it landed, Clara Dawson knew something had changed, not in the target, not in the rifle, but in herself. She was no longer a girl mocked for her defiance. She was a competitor. The sound of Clara's rifle cracked across the training ground like a thunderclap. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause. The wind stilled, conversations froze, and even the birds circling overhead wheeled away in silence. Every eye straying toward the distant target. At 50 yards, the bull's eye was little more than a pale circle against the wood. Dust floated lazily in the air as the bullet's impact sent a faint echo drifting back. Then someone shouted from the scorers. "Stand, dead center." The words rang out like a bell, shattering the hush. The crowd erupted first with disbelief, then with startled chatter. Some gasped, others laughed nervously, as though what they'd just witnessed couldn't possibly be real. One of the competitors leaned out of line, craning his neck toward the target. "No," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Can't be." But it was. A perfect shot, the bullet piercing the center with surgical precision. Clara lowered the rifle slowly, her expression calm, though her heart thundered beneath her coat. She hadn't come to gloat, but the temptation flickered at the edges of her composure. For weeks she had endured ridicule, whispers, and doubt. Now, in a single breath, a single trigger pull, she had silenced them all. Yet the trial wasn't over. The sergeant barked. Second shot. The crowd hushed again, tension knotting in the air. Clara reloaded smoothly, the motion practiced. And sure, she stepped back into her stance, the rifle snug against her shoulder. Her hands, once trembling, were steady now. It wasn't arrogance, just certainty. The jeers had quieted. In their place was something far more powerful. Attention. She drew. In a long breath, let it out, and fired. The crack rang again, and the scorer shouted, "Inside the circle, near the center." Another murmur swept through the spectators. This wasn't luck. This was skill. A third time, Clara raised the rifle. By now, even the men in line had grown silent, their earlier smirks fading into tight jaws and furrowed brows. She fired once. More, the bullet striking only a hair's width from the bullseye. The scorer's flag waved, confirming her tally. 3 for 3. Excellent marksmanship. The crowd broke into applause, scattered at first, but growing louder as surprise. Gave way to admiration. Clara stepped back, her face unreadable, though her pulse thrummed with a quiet triumph. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding her skill in the shadows of the farm. For the first time, the world saw her as she truly was. The next competitor stumbled to the line, his confidence rattled. His shots went wide, greeted with sympathetic groans from the crowd. More followed, each man struggling to recapture the attention Clara had stolen. The competition pressed on, but the energy had shifted. Where once Clara had been the butt of the joke, she was now the benchmark. From the stands, Clara caught the eye of Mrs. Whitaker, one of the town's most outspoken critics. The older woman sat stiff-backed, her lips pressed into a thin line. But even she could not disguise the flicker of surprise in her gaze. Beside her, a group of schoolchildren whispered excitedly, pointing toward Clara as though she were some kind of legend. Come to life. Still, not all faces showed admiration. Some men scowled openly, their pride wounded. For them, Clara's success was not proof of her ability, but a challenge to their identity. A woman beating them at their own game? It gnawed at their confidence like rust on steel. The sergeant, to his credit, showed no bias. His mustache twitched, as though fighting a smile, but his voice remained firm. Advance the targets to 75 yards. The second round began. The men fired, their accuracy wavering as the distance increased. Cheers and groans rose and fell with each attempt. When Clara's turn came again, the crowd fell into expectant silence. She breathed deeply, sighted the distant circle, and fired. The bullet struck near the bullseye. Applause rippled, louder than before. Her second shot followed, just as true, and by the third, the applause turned into cheers. Clara felt the shift like a tide rising beneath her feet. The same voices that had laughed now roared with approval. The same men who mocked her now studied her stance, trying to discern what secret technique gave her such precision. But there was no secret, only patience, discipline, and a refusal to bend to their scorn. As the competition progressed, Clara continued to shine. At 100 yards, her bullets found their marks with startling consistency. When the final round arrived, a test at 150 yards, the crowd leaned forward as one. By now, Clara's confidence had settled into her bones. She no longer heard the laughter, the whispers, or the doubt. All she heard was her father's voice carried across the years. Breathe slow. Let the world go quiet. Her first shot landed within the bullseye's inner circle. The crowd gasped, then erupted into applause. Her second struck near it, the cheers swelling louder. By the time her third bullet hit home, the training ground thundered with claps and shouts, as though the county itself had decided she was no longer an oddity, but a champion. When the last scores were tallied, Clara Dawson stood at the top, not tied with the men, not trailing by a fraction, but leading outright. She had outshot them all. The sergeant raised his voice over the roar. "First place, Miss Clara Dawson." The announcement sent a wave of noise through the stands. Some cheered with genuine joy, others with reluctant respect. But none could deny the truth written in the holes of the targets. Clara Dawson was the finest shot of the day. Clara lowered her rifle, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. She did not gloat, nor did she bow. She simply accepted the moment, as though it had always been waiting for her. And in a way, it had. For years, she had practiced in silence, her skill hidden from the world. For years, she had been dismissed, mocked, and underestimated. But now, with the crack of 3 perfect shots, Clara had rewritten the story they told about her. She was no longer the girl who dared to pick up a rifle. She was the woman who outshot the entire unit. When the echoes of Clara's final shot faded, the training ground buzzed with a new kind of energy. Men who had laughed until their ribs ached now stood with crossed arms, their smiles brittle, their pride dented. The crowd in the stands clapped and cheered, though some did so reluctantly, as if applause might tarnish their own dignity. Yet admiration, once ignited, is difficult to extinguish. Clara Dawson had done what none of them expected. She had not just competed, she had triumphed. The sergeant stepped forward, his boots crunching against the packed earth. He held up a slip of parchment where the tallies were written. His expression was stern, but his mustache twitched in a way that betrayed amusement. First place. He announced loudly, his voice carrying over the field. Miss Clara Dawson. The crowd erupted again. A group of children cheered the loudest, clapping their hands and shouting her name. Clara felt their joy like sunlight warming her skin. She had not entered this trial for applause, but she could not deny how sweet it felt. Her fellow competitors were slower to respond. One of them, a young farmer named Edgar, stepped forward with an awkward grin. "Well, reckon we were wrong about you, Dawson." He extended his hand, rough from labor, the gesture stiff, but genuine. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat, then accepted. His grip was firm, and when he released it, the men around him seemed less certain of their own scorn. Not all followed his lead. A burly man near the center of the line spat into the dirt, his jaw tight. "Lucky shots," he muttered, loud. Enough for others to hear. Nothing more. Clara met his gaze evenly. Luck doesn't last for 15 shots. The remark, calm but cutting, silenced him. A ripple of laughter, not mocking this time, but approving, moved through the line. The men who had doubted her were beginning to shift. Still, respect was not granted overnight. As the competitors gathered their rifles and the crowd began to disperse, Clara overheard fragments of conversation. "Never thought I'd see the day. Maybe she practices more than anyone else. Reckon it was a fluke, but still impressive." The grudging admiration made her chest swell, though she kept her expression neutral. She did not need their approval, but she knew its value. Respect, once earned, could open doors that ridicule kept locked. In the days that followed, Clara's victory became the talk of Ashford. The general store buzzed with gossip whenever she stepped inside. Mrs. Whitaker, who had once shaken her head at Clara's nonsense, now studied her with a mix of suspicion and awe. Children followed her down the street, begging her to tell them how she had learned to shoot so well. At first, the attention unsettled her. She had spent so long practicing in silence that the sudden flood of voices felt overwhelming. Yet slowly, she grew accustomed to it. She began to understand that respect was not simply about skill, it was about consistency. One victory could be dismissed as chance, but continued excellence could not. So Clara kept shooting. On the farm, she spent hours each evening with her. Winchester, perfecting her aim at longer distances, practicing in wind and in rain, adjusting for every variable nature threw her way. She experimented with timing shooting between heartbeats, shooting on a breath, shooting in the moments when her hands felt steadiest. Each practice session sharpened her skill until it became second nature, as natural to her as walking or breathing. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. Word spread beyond Ashford to neighboring towns, and soon Clara was invited to smaller exhibitions and contests. At first, the invitations came hesitantly, as though the organizers weren't sure whether a woman belonged in their midst. But her reputation preceded her, and curiosity was too strong to resist. At the first exhibition she attended, the same scene unfolded. Men laughed when she walked onto the field. They whispered, they smirked, they waited for her to fail. And then she lifted her rifle, took aim, and struck the bull's eye again and again until their whispers turned into silence. By the end of the day, it was her name the announcers praised, her performance the newspapers recorded. The pattern repeated itself at every event. Laughter greeted her arrival. Respect followed her departure, yet Clara remained humble. She did not boast, did not taunt, did not revel in others' defeat. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, letting her shots speak for her. This, more than anything, began to shift opinions. Even those most offended by her success could not accuse her of arrogance. She was simply undeniable. But not everyone accepted her so easily. There were whispers among certain groups of men that Clara's presence threatened tradition, that her victories diminished theirs. One evening at a tavern, she overheard a man mutter, "If women start winning here, what's next? Will they march into the army?" Clara smiled faintly at the thought. Why not? The resentment simmered, but it could not erase what the targets proved. Clara's shots were consistent, her results undeniable, and her growing reputation gave her shield stronger than their scorn. By midsummer, even the sergeant from the militia who had said little during the trials sought her out. He visited the Dawson farm one afternoon, arriving on horseback with dust clinging to his boots. Clara met him at the gate, rifle resting across her arms. "Miss Dawson," he said, tipping his hat, "I wanted to say, your performance at the trials was remarkable. You've set a standard our men would do well to study." Clara raised her brows. "Are you asking me to train them, Sergeant?" He chuckled, though there was truth in his laughter. "Not officially. But if you were to offer pointers, I'd not discourage it." The suggestion stunned her. Only months earlier, she had been the town's laughingstock. Now, the militia itself acknowledged her as a model of skill. Respect, she realized, was not simply being earned, it was being demanded by the evidence of her ability. That evening, Clara stood at the edge of the cornfield, the sunset painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. She set up a row of cans on the fence post and fired one after another, each falling in perfect sequence. As the last can toppled, she lowered her rifle and let the silence wash over her. The laughter of the past seemed distant now, an echo swallowed by the sound of her shots. In its place was something sturdier, something that would last: respect. Not all respected her. Yet, and perhaps some never would. But she had discovered a truth more powerful than any mockery. Respect was not given freely, nor was it reserved for men alone. It was carved, earned, and claimed one steady breath, one trigger pull, one shot at a time. And Clara Dawson was far from finished. By autumn, Clara Dawson was no longer just a curiosity of Ashford. Her name had traveled with merchants, soldiers, and newspapermen, carried on wagons and trains to towns she had never visited. Stories of the woman sharpshooter appeared, in columns tucked between advertisements for plows and sermons against whiskey. Each retelling exaggerated a little more. Sometimes she had split a bullet on an axe blade. Other times she had shot coins from the air, but the truth was still astonishing enough. Clara could outshoot nearly any man. Her fame brought invitations. At first, small towns wrote to her family, asking her to demonstrate her skills at fairs or militia drills. Then, larger cities began to take notice. One letter, stamped with the seal of a regional marksmen's association, arrived folded and official-looking, inviting her to compete in a championship held in Columbus. Clara read the letter 3 times, her pulse quickening. Competing in front of strangers was daunting enough. Competing in front of seasoned sharpshooters from across the state was something else entirely. Yet when she showed the invitation to her father, he only smiled. "You've outgrown Ashford," he said. "It's time you let the world see what you can do." So Clara packed her rifle carefully, wrapping the wood stock in an old quilt, and boarded a train bound for Columbus. The journey itself was overwhelming, the clatter of wheels on the rails, the crowded cars filled with men in suits and women in fine hats, the sheer size of the city when she arrived. Skyscrapers clawed at the sky, taller than anything she had ever seen, and the streets thrummed with horses, wagons, and people all rushing in different directions. The competition grounds were even more intimidating. Rows of polished rifles gleamed in the sunlight, their owners discussing wind resistance, trajectory, and powder loads with practiced ease. These were not farm boys with old Winchesters. These were professionals, competitors who had spent their lives in contests and exhibitions. Clara could feel their eyes on her as she walked to the registration desk, the weight of their curiosity heavy on her shoulders. Some muttered openly, "Is that her, the girl from Ashford? She won't last around against Harper or Flynn. Novelty act, that's all." But others looked on with curiosity rather than scorn. A young competitor with sandy hair tipped his hat politely. "Miss Dawson, I've read about you. I hope the stories are true. I'd like to see someone rattle these veterans for once." Clara gave a small smile. "You'll see soon enough." The first round began. Targets were set at 100 yards, and the competitors lined up their rifles gleaming under the sun. The crowd was large. Nearly 1,000 people gathered on benches and stands. Clara felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on her, far heavier than any rifle. When her turn came, she stepped forward calmly, remembering the cornfield back home, the steady breath, the silence before the shot. Her first bullet struck near the center. A murmur rippled through the crowd, her second closer still. By the third, she had landed a perfect bullseye, and applause broke out. The skeptics frowned. This was no novelty act. As the competition advanced targets at longer distances, moving targets, and trick shots designed to test speed and precision, Clara held her own. Shot after shot, she proved that her skill was no accident. By the end of the day, she had placed near the top, not first, but close enough that no one could deny her legitimacy. Reporters swarmed. "Miss Dawson, how did you learn to shoot so well? Do you believe women should be allowed in every competition? Will you continue to compete? Or was this your last exhibition?" Clara answered simply, her words measured. "I shoot because I love it. If others wish to compete, they should be allowed the same chance." The newspapers the next morning carried her picture on the front page. "Dawson dazzles in Columbus," one headline read. Another called her the Rifle Queen of Ashford. For Clara, the words were surreal, but the effect was undeniable. She was no longer a local marvel. She was a regional sensation. With recognition came opportunities and resistance. Invitations to other competitions arrived weekly, some welcoming her with enthusiasm, others begrudgingly, as though forced by public demand. At one event, the organizers nearly barred her entry until the crowd protested. At another, a fellow competitor refused to shake her hand, muttering, "This isn't a place for women." But for every insult, there were a dozen voices cheering her name, urging her forward. Women in particular flocked to see her, some shyly approaching afterward to whisper thanks. "You've shown them we can," one young girl told her, eyes bright with admiration. "You've shown me I can." Those moments mattered most to Clara. Each time a girl's eyes lit up, she felt the true weight of what she was doing. Her victories were no longer hers alone. They belonged to everyone who had been told they couldn't. The more she traveled, the more she realized how deeply the world resisted change. Newspapers praised her skill, but often reduced her to novelty, printing headlines like "Pretty and Precise" or "Beauty with a Bullet." Audiences sometimes clapped louder for her appearance than for her accuracy. It stung, but Clara refused to let it shake her. She would not let them diminish her with labels. She would prove over and over that her worth was measured by the holes her bullets left in the target, not by the curve of her smile. As autumn deepened into winter, Clara returned. T.O. Ashford briefly. The town greeted her like a hero, children waving little flags, neighbors crowding around to shake her hand. Even Mrs. Whitaker, stern as ever, muttered a grudging, "Well done, Miss Dawson." It was not affection, but it was respect, and Clara cherished it. That night, sitting by the fire, her father looked at her across the room. "You know what you've done, don't you?" "I've won a few contests," Clara said lightly. He shook his head. "You've broken the rules they never put in writing, the ones that said what women could and couldn't do. And once a rule like that is broken, it can never be mended the same way again." Clara considered his words. She hadn't set out to change the world, only to follow her own path. But perhaps by doing so, she was changing it anyway. The realization settled over her like a mantle. Her victories were more than trophies. They were cracks in the wall of tradition, fractures that would spread with each shot she fired. Clara Dawson was no longer just a markswoman. She had become a symbol, whether she wanted it or not. And symbols had power. By the spring of the following year, Clara Dawson's name was no longer confined to columns on the back pages of small-town newspapers. Now, it appeared in bold letters on posters announcing marksmanship exhibitions, on flyers for traveling, fairs, and in articles tucked beside headlines about governors and generals. The country was learning her name, and with that recognition came a responsibility Clara had never imagined when she first picked up her rifle in the quiet of her father's fields. She still loved the simplicity of shooting, the moment before. The shot when the world grew silent, a steady breath, the whisper of the trigger, but her life was no longer simple. Crowds now came to see her not only to marvel at her skill, but also to argue about what her presence meant. At one exhibition in Cincinnati, Clara overheard two men debating fiercely near the stands. "She's a fine novelty, I'll grant you." "That," one said, "but this isn't proper. What's next? Women in uniform? Women commanding battalions?" The other shook his head. "No, you're missing the point. She's proof they can do more than we've allowed. Maybe it's time." We stop laughing and start listening. Conversations like that echoed everywhere she went. Clara realized that, whether she liked it or not, her shooting had become more than a personal triumph. She was a challenge to the order of things, a living question aimed at tradition itself. It became most clear the evening she was invited to speak at a women's club in Columbus. At first, she hesitated. She was a marksman, not a speaker. Words did not come as easily to her as bullets. But when she walked into the small hall filled with seamstresses, teachers, and farmwives, there, faces lit with anticipation, Clara understood she could not remain silent. They asked her how she learned to shoot, what it felt like to face men who mocked her, and whether she believed women could compete in other fields. Clara answered honestly, her voice quiet but steady. "I never set out to prove a point." She told them, "I only wanted to follow what I loved. But the more I've traveled, the more I've seen how many doors are closed to women before they've even had a chance to knock. If my shooting proves anything, it's this: the rifle doesn't care whether the hands that hold it belong to a man or a woman. It only responds to practice, patience, and skill. The same is true of every field." The room erupted in applause, and in that moment Clara realized her rifle had become more than a tool of sport. It was a symbol, a lever she could use to shift the weight of expectation, not just for herself, but for others. Still, not everyone welcomed her growing influence. At one competition in St. Louis, a prominent competitor refused to fire until Clara was removed from the line. "This is a man's sport," he declared to the officials. "I won't make a mockery of it." The officials, pressed by a restless crowd, reluctantly allowed Clara to stay. She fired 3 consecutive bullseyes that day, while the man missed his first 2 shots. The audience roared with approval, and newspapers later mocked his protest as a tantrum unworthy of a marksman. But Clara felt no joy in his humiliation. Instead, she saw the incident for what it was: proof of how fragile the old order was, how threatened some men felt when the boundary lines were redrawn. Her victories continued to ripple outward. Letters arrived at her home from across the country, girls asking how to convince their fathers to teach them, women sharing stories of hidden talents stifled by laughter, even a few men thanking her for inspiring their daughters. Clara kept the letters neatly tied in bundles, reading them on quiet nights by lamplight. Each word reminded her that her journey was no longer hers alone. At the same time, she struggled with the weight of being seen as more than she was. She was still Clara Dawson, the girl who fed the chickens, mended fences, and read by candlelight. Yet the world seemed determined to make her into a banner, a symbol for something larger than any one person. Her father noticed the strain one evening as they sat on the porch. "You look tired, Clara." "I'm fine," she replied, though her eyes betrayed her. He studied her in silence before speaking again. You don't have to carry everyone's hopes. It's enough that you carry your own. Clara shook her head. But if I don't, who will? They need someone to show it can be done. He smiled softly. Then show them, daughter. But remember, you're more than just a rifle. Don't let them forget you're human. Those words stayed with her. She began to reveal more of herself at exhibitions, speaking not only of shooting, but of perseverance, of dignity, of the need to believe in one's worth, even when the world insists otherwise. Slowly, people stopped seeing her solely as the woman with the rifle, and began to see her as Clara Dawson, a person whose courage reached beyond the firing line. It was at a large fair in Chicago that this transformation became undeniable. Tens of thousands had gathered, the biggest crowd Clara had ever faced. She shot flawlessly, hitting every target, but it wasn't the bullets that drew the longest applause. It was her closing words, spoken into the expectant hush of the crowd. Skill belongs to no gender. Courage belongs to no single kind of person. If there is something you love, do not wait for permission to pursue it. Take it, practice it, claim it as your own. The world will try to laugh you down, but every great change begins with someone refusing to laugh along. The ovation was thunderous, not just applause for her accuracy, but for the truth she carried. Walking off the stage, Clara realized her life had turned the corner. She was no longer merely competing for trophies. She was speaking to hearts and minds, cracking open doors that had been closed for generations. The girl who once shouldered her rifle in secret was gone. In her place stood a woman who had become a voice, a symbol, and a reminder that boundaries were made to be crossed. Clara Dawson was more than just a marksman now. She was a force, one shot at a time, one word at a time, reshaping the story of what women in America could be. Years passed, and the girl who had once been mocked for daring to shoulder a rifle grew into a woman whose name was spoken across the country. Clara Dawson's story became part of America's story, a tale repeated in newspapers, in lecture halls, in kitchens and barns, where young girls whispered of the day she silenced the laughter with the crack of her shots. Clara herself never sought grandeur. She returned often to Ashford, where the rhythms of farm life grounded her. She fed the chickens, mended fences, and watched the cornfields shift through the seasons, just as she had in her youth. But no matter how quietly she tried to live, the world would not let her retreat into obscurity. Invitations continued to arrive: fairs, exhibitions, speaking engagements, even requests to train militia units. She accepted some, declined others, but everywhere she went, the same truth followed her. She was no longer simply Clara Dawson. She was a symbol of possibility. In her later years, Clara reflected often on what her journey had meant. She had never set out to start a movement. All she wanted was to hold a rifle, to prove to herself, if no one else, that skill had no gender. Yet the ripple she began spread far wider than she ever imagined. She saw it in the letters she still received, stacked in bundles by the fireplace. A girl from Kansas wrote of convincing her father to let her join a county archery club, inspired by Clara's defiance. A young woman from New York described her dreams of studying medicine, saying, "Your story taught me that laughter isn't truth. It's just fear in disguise." Even men wrote, confessing how Clara's accuracy had humbled them into teaching their daughters the same skills once reserved for sons. Her impact reached beyond words on paper. By the 1940s, as war drew young men overseas, women stepped forward into roles long denied to them: factories, offices, even the skies, as pilots in the Women Air Force Service Pilots program. Clara, older now, watched the newsreels with tears in her eyes. She saw young women wearing uniforms, their faces alight with pride, and thought, "They are walking through a door that once stood closed, and I helped place the first crack in its frame." Even those who had resisted her in the beginning could not deny her influence. The same newspapers that once called her a novelty later hailed her as a pioneer. In time, Ashford erected a small plaque near the old training ground, marking the spot where Clara Dawson silenced the laughter and changed history. Children read the inscription on school trips, wide-eyed at the idea that someone from their little town could make such a difference. Yet Clara's legacy was not carved only in stone. It lived in memory, in whispers, in the way girls carried themselves when they lifted tools or books or rifles. It lived in the resolve of anyone who faced ridicule and pressed forward anyway. In her final public appearance, Clara stood before a modest crowd in her 70s, her hair silver but her eyes still sharp. She carried her rifle, not to compete, but to remind everyone of where it had begun. Her voice, though softened by age, carried the same steady conviction it always had. They laughed when I picked up the rifle, she told them, but laughter fades. What lasts is truth. And the truth is this: ability is not bound by gender, or by expectation, or by the limits others try to place upon you. If you can do a thing, then do it steadily, faithfully, without shame. Let your work speak, and let the world adjust its ears to hear it. The applause was long, not for the shots she no longer fired, but for the trail she had blazed. When Clara passed away some years later, the nation remembered her not with parades or monuments, but with quiet reverence. Articles revisited her career, schools recounted her defiance, and families told their daughters of the woman who had outshot every man in her unit. Her rifle, carefully preserved, was donated to a museum, where it rested behind glass with a simple inscription: Clara Dawson, sharpshooter. She aimed for respect and won it. But Clara's true legacy could not be cased in glass. It lived on every time a woman stepped into a place where laughter once tried to bar the door. It echoed in the training fields where female soldiers learned to fire, in the academies where women studied side by side with men, in the competitions where no one dared to call them novelties anymore. It echoed, too, in the quiet confidence of those who faced mockery and chose to press forward anyway. They might not know Clara's name, but they carried her spirit in their determination. For in the end, her greatest shot was not the one that struck the bullseye in Ashford, or the ones that dazzled crowds in Columbus and Chicago. Her greatest shot was the one that pierced through time itself, the moment she lifted her rifle, steady and sure, and proved that laughter could be silenced by truth. The laughter faded long ago. The legacy did not. And so the story of Clara Dawson became more than just a tale of a marksman. It became a story of courage, of defiance, of the quiet, steady strength it takes to aim at the impossible and hit it clean. A story America would tell and retell, not just because it was remarkable, but because it reminded everyone that barriers, once broken, are never built the same way again. Clara Dawson was not only the woman who outshot the entire unit. She was the woman who showed the world that a steady hand, a clear eye, and a fearless heart could change history.